To ensure that this time of Bible study will be exciting, educative, and very reflective as well. So the first thing I want you to do is to spend some time praying. Secondly, to ensure that discussions flow and that there's meaningful discussion and that we keep the time dedicated to the service, it will be good to appoint a leader. This leader can be the father, mother, kids, everybody anointed of God is empowered to lead and to facilitate the discussions. The role of the person is just to ensure that we make maximum use of the time and that we moderate discussions as effective as possible. Thirdly, I want you to take note of the memory verses that are attached to every Bible study. These memory verses will serve as the anchor around which all discussions or the Bible study for that day will be held, and also a takeaway verse so that after many hours or many minutes we spend reflecting and discussing the Bible study, you would have something to take away. Fourthly, we want you to reflect through listening to other people's views. So we want a lot of discussion around the many verses that would try to give hints and clues to the questions that have been asked. Finally, prayer. After we've learned, after we've studied, we need God's power to ensure that we are not only hearers of His word, but also doers. So prayer also facilitates us by inviting God to ensure that He empowers us to carry out His word. So what are the next steps for you? Kindly rush to the church's website. We have uploaded the Bible studies there for you. Make time with your family. It could be an afternoon, it could be an evening, it could be a weekend. But whatever works for you, whatever works for your family, in these times we are in, just make time, get the Bible study material, and dig deep. There's so much that awaits you as you spend time in God's word. See you at the end of Family Month, stronger, better, and more desirous of God's word. God bless you.
Good evening, mummies, daddies, uncles, aunties, sisters, brothers, nephews. You are welcome to tonight's edition of Anaviosi. Today we'll be looking at the difficult conversations surrounding abuse, and this will be our last session for the family month. Shall we start with a word of prayer? Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for today. Thank you for your goodness and your mercies. Thank you that you've been with us throughout this month, and thank you for the issues that you've opened our minds to this month. We thank you for what you are doing in our individual homes, and we thank you for the things that you are going to continue doing in our lives. We pray committing tonight's session into your hands, asking that with a prepared heart, you, Lord, you will speak to us and enlighten us, and may your word that comes to us cause a transformation in our homes to the glory of your holy name. In Jesus' name I've prayed. Amen. On our panel for tonight, we have Dr. Carol Mathiaz O'Shea, Dr. Margaret Amankwah-Poku, and Mr. Seth Asafo.
Good evening, everyone. This evening, we are going to talk about the difficult conversations about abuse. And I am going to focus on verbal and emotional abuse. So I'll first of all briefly mention what abuse is. I'm sure most of us here know what abuse is. So I'll briefly mention what abuse is. Then I'll mention the different types of abuse. And I'll talk about verbal abuse. I'll talk about emotional abuse. And then I'll talk about the effects of verbal and emotional abuse. And then I would give you some indicators that you can use as a form of self-assessment to determine whether you are being abused in a relationship or you are abusing someone in a relationship. And then I'll end by talking about how to help someone who is being abused. So what is abuse? In very simple terms, it's a harmful or offensive treatment, often from someone the victim trusts. So quite often, where you have abuse in a relationship, the abuser is someone the victim trusts. So in a family, you can have abuse going on between a husband and a wife. There can be abuse between parents and children. There can be abuse between parent and maybe a house help in the house, or even a house help and the children in the house. And you can have abuse amongst the children as well. You can have an older child abusing a younger child. And again, you could have the situation where you have an extended family member in the house who may be abusing someone in the family, such as a child in the family. And one thing that I want to mention is that abuse is cyclical. If you are in an abusive relationship, it's a cycle. It starts by tension building. So there's tension, the abuser gets angry, begins to criticize you, begins to be violent, and then that leads into what we call explosion. So there's tension, there's explosion, and when explosion occurs, that is when the abuse actually takes place, be it physical, you being beaten by the individual, or being emotional abuse or verbal abuse. Then you get to what we call the honeymoon phase. So this is the point where after abusing you, the abuser comes and say, oh, I'm sorry, I did that. I'm really sorry, it won't happen again. I promise I'll change. And they even sometimes would accuse you and say, it's your fault. You shouldn't have made me angry. Next time, please don't say that or don't make me angry. Then suddenly they start becoming nice with you. They are pleasant with you again. And then something happens and then the tension builds and then the cycle starts all over again. So if you're in an abusive relationship, you would notice that it's a cycle. It starts and then it comes to the stage where the person is regretful and then it starts again. So what is verbal abuse? Verbal abuse occurs when repeatedly a person uses negative or demeaning words in order to gain control over you or gain control over someone. So the person tends to act in anger and use words that would help the abuser gain control over the victim. And with verbal abuse, it's not easily recognizable because it can often be overlooked. We see it as a normal way of communicating. So for example, somebody is insulting you all the time, calling you names, etc. So you may not notice that it is verbal abuse. But the whole aim of verbal abuse, the abuser wants to put you down. The abuser wants to damage your self-esteem as a victim. So it can go on without you noticing that you are being abused verbally. Now, before I go on, I want to distinguish between verbal abuse and a normal argument. So yes, as human beings, we get into arguments all the time. Every now and then, you get into an argument with your spouse, with children, etc. But then there's a difference between a normal argument and verbal abuse. So, for example, for a normal argument, it doesn't happen every day. There's no name calling. And it revolves around a specific issue. So you, as a wife, want the children to go to bed at 10. Your husband says they should go to bed at 8 o'clock. And you say, oh, it's a weekend, so let's allow them to stay up a bit. So there's an argument. So it will center around a particular issue. And also, you may agree to disagree. But then when it comes to verbal abuse, these are the red flags. The person insults you in the argument, they humiliate you, they will shout at you, and they will scream at you all the time. And there's no specific, something occurs, a situation occurs, but however, they generalize it, and then they begin to attack you. So there are several actions that can qualify as verbal abuse. You have name calling. So for example, the person who is abusing you or the abuser will say, you don't get it, sweetheart, because it's just because you are dumb. That is a form of verbal abuse. Or the person says, let me see if I can put it in simple terms so that even you can understand. It's also a form of verbal abuse. You have the abuser criticizing you. You have the abuser degrading you. So basically humiliating you and shaming you to reduce your self-confidence. All of this is to reduce your self-confidence and your self-esteem. Then we also have emotional abuse or psychological abuse. This involves behaviors, speeches, actions of spouses, of parents, caregivers, etc. that have a negative mental impact on the individual. The abuser uses words or actions or gestures that threaten or humiliate the individual that is being abused or the victim. Again, with emotional or psychological abuse, it may be hard to recognize because it's done in very subtle ways. So if you're not careful, you won't realize that you're being emotionally abused. And it can feel it can be even more destructive than physical abuse because you're put down all the time. There's name calling, there's threatening. So every time you're on edge. And so you feel as if you are actually being beaten. So when you are abused emotionally, it can be as destructive as being abused physically. And it can have, so because of that, it can have a severe impact on your mental health, basically because of the name calling, the humiliation, the threats, which you cannot do anything about. It's like verbal abuse. In fact, they actually fall in the same category. So it's very similar to verbal abuse. There's name calling, there's screaming and shouting. So the abuser displays anger, displays rage, etc. There's intimidation. So you use words, the abuser uses words to intimidate the victim. And then there's threatening, to the extent that sometimes the abuser will threaten the victim, that he or she will put the victim in an institution. It could be a child that you are threatening to put the child in an institution. Or let's say a husband who has a wife who has a disability. You threaten that you put the person in an institution, or you throw the person out of the house, etc. Now let me mention that I mentioned the fact that there's screaming and there's shouting and there's display of anger. We all get angry. Anger is a natural emotion that we all experience. It is what we do that with that feeling of anger that makes a difference. So you can get angry, but if you don't control that anger, you start acting in rage. You start raising your voice all the time. That becomes a challenge. And then suddenly that translates into verbal abuse. Now, let's look at it this way. When you go to work, sometimes you get angry. Your boss makes you angry. Your subordinates may make you angry. The question is, do you go shouting at them and beating them up because they make you angry? You don't. So my question is, why is it that when you're angry at work, you can control that anger, but when you come home, you can't control that anger and you begin to abuse the people in your home? So this is something for you to think about. What are some of the effects of verbal and emotional abuse? I've mentioned that verbal and emotional abuse fall in the same category because basically they are used by the abuser to erode the victim's self-esteem. They are used to lower their self-confidence and basically make them feel worthless. So they make you feel as if, the abuser makes you feel as if you are not of any worth. You are useless, you are hopeless. So they are the ones who have been kind enough to have a relationship with you. And when it happens that way, you feel manipulated, you feel used, you feel controlled, and you feel unwanted. So you think that, well, this is the only relationship I can stay in because I've been told over and over again that I am no good. And so it doesn't look like I can step out there and have any other relationship with anyone, but to stay in this relationship. And I've mentioned that sometimes these verbal and emotional abuse can escalate into physical abuse. So especially where there are threats, then that can escalate. And then the next thing you know, there's physical abuse. When you experience abuse in a relationship, sometimes it comes as a shock to you. You are shocked at the situation that has occurred. And so you end up in a state of denial because you can't believe that this person that I love or this person that I was expecting to have a good relationship with is suddenly becoming abusive. So you are in a state of shock. You are in a state of denial. And you are hoping that, oh, this is not true. You are wrong about this whole situation. Maybe he was very tired and that is why he flared up and he said those harsh words to me. But then you notice that it continues. It is not something that happened by chance, but it continues and then it escalates and it gets worse. So you may have the feelings of fear because you don't know what you're going to say or do that would let the abuser begin to abuse you, begin to rain insults on you and threaten you. There's confusion. You're in a state of confusion. You feel stressed out because you're always on edge. You're always trying to be careful. You're always looking around to make sure that you are doing the right thing that will not get the person angry, because the abuser has told you that you are the one who makes him angry. You are the one who makes her angry. That is why he or she reacts the way he or she does. And you feel, like I said, you feel hopeless. And there's a sense of helplessness. So you get to the point where you think, there's nothing I can do about this. I just have to stay in this relationship, or I just have to keep quiet. And you can become depressed. I mentioned the fact that verbal and emotional abuse come with mental health issues. So you can experience depression if you don't get help. You may also have difficulty concentrating, because every time you are thinking about what is going on at home, how you are being abused, how the children are being abused by your spouse, etc. So you are not able to concentrate. You go to work and it affects your level of productivity, etc. There's tension, your heart is always racing, you have difficulty falling asleep, you're having nightmares when you sleep, etc. And sometimes you even change your behavior so that you don't upset your spouse, because you are told that you are the one who makes me behave that way. And so you try to change your behavior. And sometimes you will become more aggressive than you are, or you become passive. And when you come to children, in children, verbal and emotional abuse have been linked with poor mental development. So the children may have difficulty keeping relationships or keeping strong relationships, because, as I said, the abuser is quite often somebody you trust. So someone you trust is abusing you. What happens is that you end up not trusting people around you. So it becomes difficult for you to form and build and form relationships. The child who is being abused verbally or emotionally may have problems in school. So performance may drop. There will be conduct behaviors that will require that parents will be called in because the child is misbehaving in school, etc. And then for such children, sometimes if they don't get help and they grow up, they end up having problems at their workplace and in their families as well. And all they know is the abuse that has been, the insults and the threats and the shame that has been put on them. And so they grow up in their homes also being abusive to their spouses or their children. And some of them may end up engaging in criminal behaviors if they don't get help. If you feel that you are in an abusive relationship, you are being abused by your spouse, or you are being abused by someone else in the family, you need to seek help. But we notice that sometimes you know people who are being abused, but they are still staying in the relationship, and you ask yourself, why? Why do you suffer in silence? There are several reasons why people will continue to stay in an abusive relationship, especially with in a marriage relationship. Sometimes people believe that it's their obligation to keep the relationship, so they stay in the relationship. And for some people, for them, it is marriage that validates them. So they think that without marriage, they are nothing. So they have to continue to stay in that relationship, and they don't even seek help at all. Sometimes you believe that the abuser will change. I mentioned that abuse is a cycle: tension, explosion, and then the honeymoon phase. So you think that the abuser will change, but that doesn't happen. So you're hoping the person will change, so you stay in the relationship. Sometimes also you don't get the support from your family members, so you continue in this relationship. Then again, you have children who may be attached to the abuser, or you feel that if you leave the relationship, what is going to happen is that you will lose your children, and so you stay in the relationship. Or you feel that there's nowhere for you to go, you cannot be alone, so you continue to suffer in silence. Sometimes you want to protect the abuser. You don't want anyone to know that your husband or your wife is abusing you. You find it a shame to talk about it or to let anyone know about it, so you suffer in silence. Or sometimes you are threatened. You are told that you can't leave this relationship. It is your corpse that will leave this relationship. So it's either you stay in it and you die, or if you leave, you know that wherever you're going to go, I'm going to go after you. And so you are afraid, and so you continue to be in that relationship. Sometimes also for religious reasons, we stay in the relationship. This is some form of self-assessment that you can do to find out whether you're in an abusive relationship, whether you are being abused verbally or emotionally in your relationship. So I'll ask you these questions. Are you afraid of your spouse? Do you sometimes feel trapped in your relationship? Do you feel you can't discuss with your spouse what is bothering you? Does your relationship swing back and forth between a lot of emotional distance and being close? So think about the explosion and the honeymoon phase. Does your spouse try to isolate you from friends, family, or groups? Does your spouse limit your access to work or material resources? Does your spouse frequently criticize you, humiliate you, or undermine your self-esteem? Does your spouse ridicule you for expressing yourself? So ask yourself these questions. And if your response is in the affirmative, then you are probably in an abusive relationship and you need help. You can get help from a friend, from a family member, from a counselor, somebody, a minister in your church, or seek professional help, see a psychologist. So what can we do as Christians if someone comes to us and says, I'm in an abusive relationship, or I'm being abused by my spouse or someone in my family? First of all, stay calm, don't be that judgmental. Quite often when we hear these things, we are in shock and we say, really, is that true? Are you telling me that your wife abuses you or your husband? Oh, Mr. Kujo, how can he do that? So straight away, the person who is telling you that she's being abused may withdraw because you're being judgmental. So if you have someone coming to you with an issue such as this, don't be judgmental. Stay calm, be supportive, be compassionate, and assure the person of confidentiality. If you can't help the person, direct the person towards where he or she can get help from. And don't help the person to make rash decisions. Direct the person to maybe the minister, a counselor, etc., if you are not in a position to help. And for an individual who is in an abusive relationship, talk about it. Use family resources where you can. Maybe there's somebody in the family who you can tell about the abuse, who can help deal with the situation. But then again, be careful, because there are some spouses who don't want any family member to know what is going on in their marital home. So know who you can talk to, or seek outside help. Get help from the church. Talk to your minister. Talk to your counselors who took you through counseling when you were getting married. And above all, seek professional help. You may get to a point where you are depressed, you are stressed, you are on edge all the time, your self-confidence has been broken, you don't have any confidence at all in yourself, etc. So you would need professional help to help you to build your self-confidence, to help you to find yourself, to help you to assert yourself in the relationship that you are in. So I'll conclude with these Bible verses. Ephesians 4:29, it says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up, according to their needs, and that it may benefit those who listen. So what does it say? We shouldn't let any unwholesome talk come out of our mouths. We should say things that are helpful in building others. So let's take a cue from this. Let's not be abusive towards our partners or towards members of our family, towards our children, etc. And then Ephesians 4:31-32 says that, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. So let's remember that as well. No bitterness, no rage, no anger. I've mentioned that anger is a natural emotion. We all experience it. But how we react is what makes the difference. So if you think you are in an abusive relationship, or you are abusing someone in a relationship, please stop the abuse. Don't choose to be abused or be an abuser. Thank you, and God bless you.
let us talk about the uncomfortable topic of abuse. A lot of the time, people have asked, what is abuse? Essentially, abuse is anything that gives you an advantage over another person. Simply put, abuse is a way of gaining control or power over somebody else. Now, more classically, we'll define abuse as behaviors that are orchestrated directly or indirectly, aggressively or non-aggressively to gain an advantage over somebody. And in so many instances, I've heard people say things like, I cannot be abused. But remember one thing, the statistics from WHO shows that 1 in 3 people would have experienced some form of abuse, specifically sexual or physical, in their entirety of life. And abuse is no respecter of persons. There are people of varying socioeconomic statuses, educational levels, who are still abused. I know several people who I've worked with who have doctorate degrees who are being abused by their partners. Is that interesting? Thank you. Now, I'm going to focus more specifically on physical and sexual abuse. And I'm going to look at it from the perspective of physical abuse in adults and then in children, and then sexual abuse in adults and then in children. So, what is physical abuse in the first place? So, physical abuse is an intentional and unwanted contact with you or something close to your body. And sometimes the abusive behavior does not cause pain, but it actually has a very significant effect on you. Now, what are the signs of physical abuse? From my perspective, abuse starts with a conditioning where the abuser puts you in a certain frame of mind or scope of operation that fits the mindset or that fits the play that or the control that they want to gain over you. Basically, you'll notice certain signs of being isolated, which also seems to be consistent with several other degrees of abuse. So they'll isolate you from people just so that people might not see the signs that you're being abused, or just so that you might not have anybody who will give you any ideas to try and get away from the abuse. The way they portray themselves to you and sometimes make you feel a lot of pity for them by telling you a story of how they've been abused before or how they were abused as children, and therefore you sort of pity them a lot of the times. And when they're doing or they're abusing you in any way, you would normally rationalize and say, this is just such a broken person and they don't know how to deal with their abuse, and that's why they're deflecting it on me. Then also, you notice signs of biting, choking, punching, slapping, sometimes threatening you with a gun or a knife consistently, sometimes depriving you also of physical things like food or being able to go out, are all essentially extensions of physical abuse. Physical abuse is something that most of us are familiar with, or in the different facets of abuse, physical abuse is one that most of us are able to notice because of the physical scars that it leaves, or the swollen eyes, or the wounds that you see. So it's something that most of us are very much aware of. It's important for me to say that an aspect of sexual abuse is actually physical abuse, because there's an aspect of physicality in sexual abuse. Now, let's look at physical abuse in children. And predominantly, the concern has been, at what point is it an abuse and not disciplining? As a typical Ghanaian who's been through a system where we used to enjoy our parents' lashes to correct us, it becomes difficult for us to answer the question, is corporal punishment bad? But there are a number of things that we must notice. Remember that physical abuse directed at children is supposed to gain control. So you might actually get the child to fear you so that you have control over them. That does not in any way mean that the things that you expect of them, they will do when you are not there. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that there's a certain rationalization that we have about physical punishment or corporal punishment, which is essentially physical abuse, in the sense that we are correcting the child. But there's a necessary criteria to meet for correction. One, the punishment you're giving out must not be excessive of the act that's performed. So if a child accidentally breaks a glass, I don't think anyone beats a child for doing that anymore, but it used to happen in the past. And then you are beating the child with belts and canes and chains. That is problematic. because it's not correcting anything. It's only creating an avenue of fear within that particular child. Now, that the second criteria is that the punishment should follow directly after the behavior if you're trying to correct behavior. Abuse becomes excessive, or physical corporal punishment becomes excessive if it is not proportionate to the act that's been committed, first of all, and if it doesn't directly follow the behavior. I've worked with a child who used to tell me about how sometimes he'd be sitting down and dad would just slap him, or mom would just throw something at him for no apparent reason. That is abuse. It has no purpose or no functionality in any way for the child and their development. Then also, the purpose of giving out punishment is supposed to correct and modify behavior. So if you're beating someone to the point where they fear you, it doesn't modify behavior. It only causes them to fear you. Now, what are some of the effects of physical abuse in children? There's a typical distrust of the world. So they fear the world, and children like that become very timid. They lack the ability to take initiative to do things, and thereby it affects their self-esteem. Also, they have difficulty forming relationships since they cannot trust the world. Neither can they trust, if their immediate family they cannot trust, i.e. mom and dad. How can they trust somebody else? Then also, it brings about a lot of anger issues. So anger issues, basically, most people feel very comfortable expressing anger rather than hate. So in order for me not to feel hurt, I'd rather express my anger. And these things can also affect academic performance in children, so with regards to physical abuse. Now, let's talk about sexual abuse. So, sexual abuse has to do with any act that's supposed to give a sexual advantage of one person over the other. Generally, it involves acts such as rape or forced sexual intercourse with a person against their will or towards a person who hasn't given consent. It will also include acts that we normally term as sexual assaults, which includes touching someone in inappropriate places without their consent, taking advantage of someone who has some form of compromised intellectual functioning, that they could be having some form of mental challenge, or that they are intoxicated. And years ago, that used to happen a lot, where people get people drunk just to take advantage of them sexually. Now, it also involves having sex in unconventional ways, which is either anally or in an oral way that somebody may not consent to. All of these things will fall under the scope of sexual abuse, especially in adults. Now, with sexual abuse, one thing that you have to notice a lot is a term we call grooming. Grooming is an orchestrated act which involves several things that a person does to gain the trust of another person so they can abuse them. So typically, you'll find that maybe your boss or your friend gives you a lot of praise. They admire you. They tell you you are strong. They give you lots of gifts. And these things are supposed to get you to trust them. Now, in my work, for example, I've noticed a lot of these things happening, especially with people who've lost a parent. And then somebody steps in to become like the father figure or the mother figure, and is constantly showering praise and encouragement, all with the single motive of having to have some form of sexual intercourse with them. And that's a term that we call grooming. So in children, I'm sure most of us think that, well, I'm never going to have my child abused sexually, especially the things that I can control. But are you aware that, for example, exposing a child to sexual material, whether directly or indirectly, is also sexual abuse? So if a child should find some form of sexual material like pornography on your phone, that in itself is you exposing them to sexual material. So that is an abuse. Or that mom and dad are doing their own stuff and suddenly the child bumps in to see the whole act. That is sexual abuse. Also, looking at, for example, exposing your own body or the child's body to other people or yourself, in itself is sexual abuse. And this is something that happens a lot with some clients that I've seen, where they say, I was bathing with my child. It gives the child unrealistic expectations about sex. And these things are essentially part of the abuse story. And then also, if you are not regulating the exposure of your child to, for example, the use of the internet or to the media world, as it were, and they stumble across material that are sexual in nature, that is also a form of sexual abuse. Now, there are several effects that people may have as a result of sexual abuse. One of them has to do with they might have challenges with sex in the future. So we take a typical case of somebody who's been raped. The rape ordeal might make the person have challenges with considering sex to be a pleasant thing for the entirety of their life, which means that if they go on to form lasting relationships in marriage, the sexual response might not work the way it should, and that would cause significant challenges for the relationship. Also, in some people, we've noticed that because their first encounter or their first sexual experience was some form of rape, their mind is that it's the only way to show affection, and therefore they actually become hypersexual. Not that they want to, but that's the way the mind has constructed that particular act for them. Then also the issue of guilt. So lots of people who have been abused sexually, they feel a deep sense of guilt where they blame themselves for the act. It's good for you to know that if you've ever been sexually abused or assaulted in any way, it is not your fault. It doesn't also mean that if somebody does not say no, it means yes. Recently, there was something in the media about someone talking about how rape victims enjoy the act. Look, the human body works in this way. It's conditioned to react to certain things. During sexual stimulation, the body prepares for the act. Therefore, if somebody gets wet in the process of even a rape, it doesn't in any way mean that they consented to it. The technical name for this is arousal non-concordance. So let's be careful about this particular instance where you say, but the person was into it. Once they say no, once they haven't given you permission, it is sexual abuse. So what are some of the things that we can do to help ourselves mitigate the challenges of being in a relationship or an abusive physical or sexual relationship? The most important thing to know is this, to note the signs. Remember, abusers are not dressed like horrible people. They are cunning, loving people. In fact, the way they act or the way they are in the public makes it difficult for anyone to believe that they can actually be abusive in any way. But remember the signs. If, for example, someone abuses you, and typically with physical abuse, it starts with verbal abuse, little insults, and then suddenly a little shove, and then a little push, and then one hit, two hits, and now it's punches, and now they're choking you, and they're threatening you with a gun, or they're threatening you with some form of a knife. Now remember, after all these acts, they'll come back to say, I'm so sorry, I don't know what came over me. All of these things are an act of conditioning you where you suddenly feel like you want to go, and then they put in a performance that makes you stay. And the longer you stay, the more your mind normalizes the process. And so when you actually want to go, your mind says, oh, but last time, remember, he's just a broken person. So notice the signs of abuse. 2, do not allow yourself to be isolated. Abusers thrive in isolation. So they will isolate you from your friends, from your family. They might even ask you to stop working so that nobody can control you or give you any form of strength to overcome their hold or their control over you. So each time you notice that somebody is trying to isolate you from the people who care about you, from the people you care about, please be careful. It might be a sign of abuse. Also, it's important for us in this age to talk to children about the dreaded topic, sex. Sex education is very important in children. We must make we must make a conscious effort to talk to children about the forms of sexual abuse. You must make your child understand that their private part is private. Explain the word private. Private means that nobody else must have access to it. And I know that this is very difficult for most parents. But if you don't do it, the child will find the information somewhere else. Or somebody else will do it for you. So you might as well do it because you would have all the good intentions for your child as compared to some callous young man or woman who is obviously looking for just looking for a victim, as it were. So it's good for us to talk to them. Be careful when someone keeps calling your son or your daughter, my wife, my husband. Please stop those kinds of things. Do not force your child to sit on any person as an uncle or an auntie. Don't do any of those things. These are the ways where you teach a child to become private and make them understand that there are aspects of their body which are for them and for them alone. So that education is important. And more importantly, whenever you notice that you have a friend, you have somebody who is in a situation of this kind of abuse, please get help for them. You might not be in the best position to offer them the help they require to be empowered to escape this particular cycle. But if you get help from a professional, they might be able to empower them to do this. And also, don't forget that there are resources that are available for help. Report to the police. They will move it to the DOFSU unit, and social welfare will also take charge. And then, as a professional, I've had several instances where these cases have been referred to us, especially in cases of sexual and then physical abuse, where we've had to help manage them to overcome the effects. In most cases, the physical effects is what most of us see, but the underlying psychological effects are so significant. We all have to play a part to cure this menace.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Family Month at Accra Ridge Church. This evening, we'll be talking about a rather difficult topic. We're covering having difficult conversations, and we're talking about abuse. And I'm very honored to be here, even though the topic I'm covering is not one that's very pleasant. I believe it's important that we have these conversations, especially as a community and as a church family, because these are conversations that are very necessary. And I'm here to talk to you this evening about domestic and child abuse. Child abuse is one of the forms of abuse that's really difficult to talk about because it involves the most vulnerable and innocent members of our society. And so I'll talk about what domestic and child abuse is. I'll talk about what are some of the signs and symptoms we should be looking out for. And then I'll try and dispel some common myths around child abuse. I think it's important to address myths because they usually misinform us and mislead us. And then finally, I'll conclude by talking about, as a community, as a family, what is our responsibility and what should our response be when it comes to issues of abuse. And so to start off, here's a quote about domestic abuse. Domestic abuse can be so easy for all of us to ignore. It often happens without any witnesses, and it is sometimes easier not to get involved. Yet, by publicly speaking against domestic violence, we can together change the attitudes towards violence in the home and show that domestic abuse is a crime and not acceptable. So what is domestic abuse? If we think about what the word domestic means, I'm sure different things like the home, people living together, all of those things come to mind. So in a very broad sense, domestic abuse is any kind of abuse, be it physical, verbal, sexual, psychological, that takes place in a domestic setting. In the past, domestic abuse has been referred to as violence abuse. So violence that takes place or abuse that takes place between partners. But in recent times, it's been broadened to include abuse in the home against children, parents, the elderly, and for most people who have help living with them, domestic abuse also covers any form of abuse against anybody you have living in your home, whether it's your nanny, somebody you might call a maid, a gardener, anybody living in the home. Globally, however, women are the majority in terms of people who fall victim to domestic abuse, right? And so when we think about that kind of abuse between partners, then we are talking about an incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening, degrading, and violent behavior against your partner, including sexual violence by a family member or a carer, right? Like I said earlier, it is very common, and in the vast majority of cases, it's experienced by women and perpetrated by men. I do want to sound a note of caution that there are an increasing number of cases where men are the victims and women are the perpetrators. There's some argument around whether or not that has always been the case, or now there are more incidents and cases where men are reporting that they are being abused. So that's domestic abuse. Now I'll quickly run through what some of the signs are. Domestic abuse is not easy to spot. In terms of physical signs and symptoms, of course, you might notice bruises that can be explained, covering up of body parts when maybe it isn't necessary. Maybe it's extremely hot, but you notice that someone is always covering her arms. Those could be some of the signs. But in terms of the emotional signs of domestic abuse, looking out for things like changes in sleeping habits, changes in eating habits, agitation or anxiety or constant apprehension and worry, someone who is extremely apologetic or meek, low self-esteem, when someone seems fearful. Those are some of the things to look out for when it comes to domestic abuse. However, I do want to point out that these are signs and symptoms, right? Things that should tell us that something might be going on here, not things that definitely tell us that abuse is happening. So it's important to keep that in mind. Now, someone might ask, what are some of the causes of domestic abuse? Why would anyone want to physically or otherwise hurt someone they claim to love, such as their wife or their husband or anyone living with them? One of the biggest causes is beliefs about punishment. A lot of cultures believe that one of the ways to either punish a spouse, a child, or somebody who's living with you, who's helping you in the home, is to physically discipline them. And a lot of people can't tell where to draw the line between what is punishment and what then becomes abuse. So our understandings about punishment and discipline and what that entails are some of the things that cause domestic abuse. Research has also found that there's a link between substance abuse and domestic abuse. And it can also be intergenerational. So if you think about how powerful modeling is, if a child grows up in a home where he sees a lot of domestic abuse and domestic abuse is rampant, he may grow up to think that that is the way to handle his or her home and then keep it going through generations. Now, when we come to talk about child abuse, like I said earlier, it's one of the hardest forms of abuse to talk about because it involves children. And children are the most innocent and vulnerable members of our family, our society, our community. And in Matthew 18:6, it says, if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and be drowned into the depths of the sea. That tells us how precious children and their well-being are to God. And so it's important that we pay particular attention when it comes to child abuse. But what is child abuse? Child abuse, by definition, a simple definition, is any intentional harm or mistreatment that is caused to a child under the age of 18 years. And different forms can occur: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, verbal abuse, and neglect. Now, research has found that these different forms often occur together. When you find situations in which a child is being sexually or physically abused, they are often also being emotionally. Even if you think about what sexual abuse or physical abuse does to a child emotionally, then of course there's also emotional abuse happening. And sadly, very, very sadly, a majority of people who perpetrate child abuse are people that the children know, right? And so even though we teach children to be wary of strangers and stay away from strangers, research has found that a very high number, I think more than 90% across different cultures, are people that the children know. So people who live in their home, a family member, or somebody in a close circle. And so when we talk about child abuse, what are some of the things we need to be looking out for? And once again, I will sound a note of caution that these are just signs that should maybe give us cause for concern and to explore, but not things to tell us there's definitely child abuse happening here. But if a child who's maybe extroverted, outgoing, very bubbly and full of life, suddenly or maybe over time becomes very withdrawn, that should be a cause of concern for all of us. If we notice other changes in behavior, maybe a child becomes overly aggressive or hyperactive, that's also a sign of concern. One major sign of concern is if there's a sudden drop in their academic performance in school. If this is a child who does really well in school, is engaged in school, and we see a change in how they are doing in school, that should concern us. Children who lack supervision, parental supervision, generally tend to fall victim more often than children who don't. And then if there's a reluctance to go home, either from church, this child doesn't want to go home, or from school, they are very reluctant to go home, that is definitely not a good sign. And then things like attempts to self-harm themselves, attempts to run away from home, those are all things that are usually a child's way of trying to shout out for help when they feel no one is really paying attention. And then one thing that often occurs when child abuse is taking place is a regression in development. So a child who's maybe way beyond their thumb sucking years all of a sudden starts sucking their thumb, starts wetting their bed when they've stopped, or starts speaking in a very childlike voice. So maybe a teenager who maybe then all of a sudden starts talking like a child. These have all been found to be signs that something quite isn't right. Now, when we think about the different types of child abuse, there might be specific things to look out for. So with physical child abuse, you're looking for unexplained injuries. If a child is always showing up in school or at church with injuries that for which the explanations don't make any sense, or the same injury keeps occurring over and over again, or you notice different bruises on different parts of their body that seem to be at different stages of healing, and their explanations just don't add up, that's usually not a good sign. And once again, especially in our climate, if there's a child who always seems to want to be completely covered up and maybe in clothes that might seem uncomfortable, that can be a sign that they might be trying to cover up bruises. But it's important to keep in mind that people who physically abuse children are usually quite smart about it. So they try and inflict bruises in places that cannot be easily seen, right? Or that can be covered up. So physical injuries might not be easy to spot. With sexual abuse, one of the telltale signs is if a child has inappropriate knowledge or behavior, sexual behavior for their age. If they know way too much about sexually related topics and they are constantly talking about it, or they talk about it with a certain level of confidence that we know is way above their age, then that should be concerning to all of us. And especially also for sexual abuse, we often see the regression in development that I was talking about. For neglect, we have to look out for things like poor hygiene. So you notice a child who's constantly dirty, who looks like no one is paying any particular care for him or her. That's not a good sign. A child who is incredibly underweight and sometimes overweight can also be a sign of neglect, because someone might not necessarily be paying attention to what that child is eating or not eating. And also a child who maybe constantly hides food for later. So you'll notice them in school or church or at functions sort of putting food away. It might be because they're not getting enough food to eat at home. Like I said earlier, these are signs and symptoms and not necessarily things for us to stand on and accuse parents and carers of abuse. But these are things that when we notice, we should definitely be concerned about. I will now talk about what are some of the common myths around child abuse specifically. Like I said at the beginning, myths are important because they can be quite dangerous, right? They sort of take on an air of being facts, and people talk about them, and it can be very misleading, especially when we are trying to get educated on these matters. One of the biggest myths about child abuse is that children are victimized by creepy, psychopathic strangers that the children don't know at all. research has found that this is actually not true. Globally, across different cultures and societies, about 90% of children, child abuse victims, know their abuser. So the abuser either is a family member, sometimes in the nuclear family, extended family, friends, people who are in their circle. So they know their abuser. It is not a stranger. So as much as we tell children to stay away from strangers, which is a good thing, unfortunately, when it comes to abuse, a lot of victims of child abuse know their abuser. The second myth that I'd like to talk about is that the most common type of abuse children experience at home is sexual abuse. This is not true. Neglect is actually the most common type of abuse globally in different cultures. The reason why a lot of people believe sexual abuse is the most common form of abuse is a lot of times because of how dramatic stories of sexual abuse sound and how they are sensationalized when they are being reported. And I guess in terms of, even though there isn't a hierarchy, when you think of abuse, when you think of sexual abuse, a lot of us are really appalled by the idea of sexually assaulting a child. And so it seems like that's the most common one. But the most common form of child abuse is actually child neglect. A lot of children aren't receiving the right amount of care for their physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual development. The third myth that I'd like to talk about is that we tend to believe that children usually tell someone that they are being abused. This is not true. In a majority of cases, children are not likely to disclose. And I think this is a really sad point, but I think it highlights even more why, as a community, as a family, as a society, it falls on us. Because if a child is being abused and they are not going to say anything, then we should be the ones who spot it and help them. Now, if you think about a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, sometimes as young as that, we know cases of babies being abused. But if you think of a child and the weight of having to tell someone that is within the family, sometimes a father or a mother or a brother or a cousin is doing these things to them, a lot of children aren't able to tell anyone. So it really does fall on us to look out for the children in our lives. The fourth myth that I'd like to dispel is that males who are sexually abused as boys all grow up to sexually abuse children. This is not true. Some do, yes, but male abuse victims rarely go on and become perpetrators of sexual abuse themselves. I think that's really important to clarify. And then the last myth I'd like to talk about is that only men sexually and physically abuse children. And so we tend to think children are always safer with women. That is unfortunately not true. Globally, in different cultures, we found that at least 20% of the child abuse that is reported is committed by women. And so there are women who are sexually abusing boys. There are women who are physically abusing children. And so men are not the only perpetrators. I think it's really important that we have some of these facts straight as we get educated about the importance of these things. In conclusion, I would like for us to think about, as a family, as a community, what is our responsibility when it comes to these issues? Like I said at the start, these are not comfortable conversations to have, but these are very necessary conversations because domestic and child abuse happens. It happens more than we realize, and it happens within the church. So these are conversations that we need to have. So what is our responsibility? What should our response be? I think, first of all, having these difficult conversations is very important. We should be bringing these kinds of conversations to the center of the things that we do. Because the very nature of abuse, whether it's sexual, physical, psychological neglect, is that it thrives on secrecy and shame. And so when we don't talk about them, they stay in the dark, and the darkness allows them to thrive. So it is our responsibility to bring them out of the dark, and tackle them head on together as a community. So let's talk about these things. Talk about them in church, talk about them at home, talk about them at your workplace, talk about them with your friends. Let's have these conversations. They are really very important. In order to have these conversations, we need to get educated. In the world we live in today and all the access we have to information, there's no excuse for us to not be educated on these matters, right? In order for us to have these conversations and have effective conversations, we need to get educated so that we can then educate other people, so that you know what language to use when you're talking about issues as this. So have these conversations, get educated. We also need to think about, as a church community, are we a safe space for anyone who might be experiencing the kinds of abuse that we've talked about? And we might say our first response might be, yes, of course, the church is a safe space. But that isn't always true. And I think it falls on us to be critical in examining whether or not we do offer a safe space for anyone who is dealing with these issues. Like I said earlier, for children and adults as well, they are not likely to disclose that they are being abused. So we should be on the watch and the lookout for some of these signs and symptoms that I shared, so that we can advocate on behalf of people who aren't able to do that for themselves. And in thinking about whether or not we are a safe space, I'd like to encourage us to think about the conversations we have, right? And some of the insensitive things we might say that might be a trigger for someone who's experiencing abuse but isn't able to talk about it. So when we are in groups and we're joking and we're laughing and we're sharing stories, what kinds of things might we be saying that might be insensitive to someone in the room? Research tells us that if you have a group of 10 people, especially women, chances are one or two or three of them may have experienced some kind of abuse in their lifetime. And so I think we need to pay attention to the kinds of things we are saying when we are having conversations. And besides, as believers, we shouldn't be having conversations if they're not conversations that edify and uplift each other. So it's important that we pay attention to that. Closely related to that, we have to hold each other accountable. So if you have a friend or a coworker or someone you come to church with who makes really inappropriate and insensitive jokes about abuse and things that you know they really shouldn't be saying, you have to call them out. We can't laugh it off or sit uncomfortably quiet while these things go on. So it's important that we hold each other accountable for the things that we say. We hold each other accountable for whether or not we are providing a safe space for anyone who might be experiencing these things. And then what is our responsibility when it comes to care? And this area can be a little controversial in the church and in religious circles because we've been accused of over spiritualizing things, especially when it comes to things like this that are criminal, right? So if we do find out that some form of abuse, either domestic or child, is happening in our congregation, what do we do, right? It is a crime, and we have a duty to report it as a crime. Now, by saying that we report it as a crime, it doesn't mean that we don't offer a certain level of care and support to everyone involved. Of course, to whoever the victim is, it absolutely falls on us to make sure that we're providing medical care, psychological support, and any other kind of support that they might need. But in addition to carrying out our duty of reporting it as a crime, we do also need to provide support for the perpetrators, because it is not psychologically, no one who is psychologically healthy does the kinds of things I've just talked about. So clearly, whoever is abusing a child, abusing their wife or husband or helper in the house, they also need some kind of help because there's something going on there. So we need to report it as a crime. There are no two ways about it. It is a crime. We need to make sure that we are providing support and care for the victim first and foremost, but also not neglecting the perpetrator, right? And then thinking about, as a community, what kind of advocacy work are we doing when it comes to things that have to do with abuse and child abuse? The church is powerful in terms of the things that we can get done in any society. And so thinking about our laws and policies when it comes to child abuse, policies and institutions, our laws around domestic abuse, we have a lot of power in being able to advocate for change in these areas. So as a congregation, what are we using our power for when it comes to things of abuse? So I think these are very important things that we need to think about when it comes to what our response should be when we talk about child abuse and domestic abuse. These are not easy conversations to have, but the more we have these conversations, the more likely we are to be able to eradicate these kinds of things from within us. And so I hope that this will encourage all of us to get educated, to continue the conversations at home, to be on the lookout for each other, especially for our children who are precious to God especially, and to continue to look out for like I said each other, and to continue to take care of each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us in tonight's session. Please be reminded that there'll be a Zoom question and answer session on Saturday, 29th August at 6:30 p.m. Also, for the month of September, we will be having our career month, and there are questionnaires being circulated. Do take time to answer them. Thank you.